Today I want to focus on a phenomenon I come across quite a lot when we're talking to clients and businesses, where there's an almost overly, the client is overly focused on compliance, legal compliance, which is understandable, but they're focused on it almost obsessively to the detriment of actually having in place a management system that will achieve compliance. Because what tends to happen is they end up in the weeds, deep in the weeds, in the detail. They go into all these different pieces of legislation separately to find out if there's anything in there that could trip them up, or if there's any piece of legislation that they happen to be not compliant with, and so they can identify the gap and they can fix it, and then they'll move on to another piece of legislation and see whether there's anything, whether there's any holes or traps to fall into with that piece of legislation, and then on to the next one. Well, that's a very inefficient way of going about things. That's going to lead to a lot of confusion and potentially a lot of panic as well, and there's a lot of stress down that road. What would be better is to focus on not on legislative compliance. Actually, the best way to achieve compliance is to not focus too much on it, but instead to have in place a good management system, supported by the organisation, by the directors. A good management system. Once you've got it in place, you've got yourself then the infrastructure that will allow you to comply with the compliance. The legal compliance will be a consequence of the management system. Because what you will find is, with a lot of legislation, there are common themes that run through it. If you look for it, you'll find the Plan, Do, Check, Act system in many pieces of legislation. It won't be laid out explicitly like a Plan, Do, Check, Act model, but it'll be there. And therefore, what you can have is, once you've got a good management system infrastructure in place that enables compliance with one piece of legislation, it'll probably be already sort of 90% compliant with lots of other pieces of legislation as well, without you having to go to each piece of legislation separately and consider how best to achieve compliance with it one at a time. That's just so inefficient and very stressful, I would imagine. Focus more on the management system, and things will fall into place much easier than they would otherwise. And another question it's kind of related, another question we get asked a lot is something along the lines of, where would we stand, or sometimes it's where would I stand, like a person is referring to themselves. They've got themselves worried about where they would stand legally if XYZ happens, some sort of scenario that they've got under consideration. Where would they stand legally if XYZ? And I think maybe that's the wrong question. Again, it's an understandable question, but maybe the better question would be, how do we ensure the health and safety of our people and others that can be affected by our business? Simple as that. By focusing on that, you ensure that you go as far as you can to ensure that you never end up having to be faced with that prospect of, where do you stand if XYZ? Don't focus too much on that question. Take a step back and think, right, how as an organisation are we going to best ensure the health and safety of anyone that could be affected by our undertaking? And again, if you focus on that, then the other question, where do you stand if XYZ, that sort of takes care of itself. Do you agree, disagree? Let me know. Make some comments and ask some questions, and I'll try and answer them as best I can.